Hello, everyone, from the Temple in Independence. Welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ identity, mission, message, beliefs, and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director for CIMM, the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, through the Graceland and Community of Christ Seminary. Welcome back. We've been on break for a little while, and it's good to see so many people who have been joining us anew this session. Again, today we have Tony and Charmaine Chvala-Smith with us, doing part 6. Is that right? Five. Part 5 of our series of Called to Question, Community of Christ Theology. And we last time got through the Frederick M. Smith session, and now we're going to go to the next president of the church, I would assume, as we turn it over to Tony and Charmaine. So good to have you guys with us.
Really good to be here.
Thank you, David, and we're just very glad to be with all of you for this 5th session, which we've subtitled Harmony, Unity, and Pastoral Care, the Israel A. Smith Era. And if you read much Israel A. Smith, you'll see that he really liked the words harmony and unity, as well he should after Fred M's tenure in the presidency.
You'll have to go and watch the previous session if you want to know more about that.
So it's our practice to begin these just with a few reminders. And we're doing theology in these. We're doing actually what's called historical theology. And theology is 2 things. It's a verb. It's something you do. And there's the old Latin definition, fides qua intellectum, faith seeking understanding. And actually, I left a letter off the one Latin word there. That's bad. Fides qua intellectum should be. So pardon my Latin if there's any Latin teachers watching here. And so sometimes theology is something we do. We reflect on our faith. Why do we believe X? Why do we practice Y? And so that means that all of you who are in the session are in some ways theologians. Also, theology is a noun. It can be the product of the reflection. A theology is the beliefs, the thoughts, the practices, actions, and teachings that shape the life and identity of a religious community. So we have a community of Christ theology, and in community of Christ, we do theology. We think about that.
So one of the things that is our goal through this whole series is to say, how did we get here from there? And from there is our beginning point. So 1831, Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, 5E, where we describe ourselves as a church as the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth. And then more recently, in 1996, we made another very different kind of statement about who we are and what's the elements of our theology in Doctrine and Covenants 161, where we talk about claiming, where it says, claim your unique and sacred place within the circle of those who call upon the name of Jesus Christ. So you see the shift from us being the whole thing, the final answer in some ways, to now recognizing ourselves in the circle of others who know and follow Christ. And that is where we're called to be at this point. So it's a big jump between those 2 places. And one of our main purpose is to help you understand, how did we get here from that very different kind of beginning?
So important to say, because the way we like to teach Community of Christ theology mostly is to teach it historically, how we developed along those lines. And we all know that church history, church story is really important in our movement. Church history, church story is one of the sources of theology that is called tradition. And so theology draws from tradition as one of its sources, along with scripture and experience and rationality and so on. And this is important because memory shapes our identity. But here's the tricky thing. Our history is not the church's message. It's not the message of the church. It's how we came to be who we are. And the church, by the way, is not a museum. We may have museums here and there, but we're not a museum. The church's message is the good news of Jesus Christ. That's so important for us to keep in mind. And if we keep that in mind, then it's okay if in our church's long story, we have ups and downs and we have good stuff and bad stuff, and people do weird things and wacko things, and people do great things and amazing things. That's the human saga, right? But that's not the message. That's just us. That's just us being us, right? But the message is the good news of Jesus Christ.
So history is a good way of tracking how our theology has changed. And that's kind of how we're doing this session. One of the things we want to acknowledge right away is that as we prepare for these sessions, we do a lot of reading, and we look to see what other people have said and researched. So for today, places where we went to understand more about Israel A. Smith is from Paul Edwards' book, Our Legacy of Faith, A Brief History of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is from 1991. And then Mark Shearer's The Journey of a People, Volume 3, The Era of Worldwide Community. And that was published in 2016.
And we don't get anything for this, but if you
No
do not,
commission.
if your congregation does not have Mark's 3 volumes, please get them. They are fabulous. They're really, really important. So where we're going next, we want to talk a little bit about who Israel A. Smith was. It's important because in a sense, when you trace the church's theological journey, we trace it through presidents, right? Because of the nature of our church. You could do it. You could do it otherwise, but it's kind of easy to periodize it that way. So harmony, unity, and pastoral care. And the basic question is, how did reorganization theology develop during Israel A. Smith's presidency? And his presidency wasn't long, actually, 1946 to 1958. So as presidents had gone up to that time, it was a short tenure. So the question then is, who is this person that we're gonna kind of focus on tonight? And there's a great photo of Israel A. And here's just some background. First of all, he was born in 1874. He's 2 years younger than Fred M. And he died in 1958. So he's the half brother of Fred M. Smith. By training, Israel A. was a lawyer, and apparently he was a good one. He also had a very brief political career in Iowa in the state legislature. I won't tell you what party he belonged to, but let's just say it was different then. So he served in the presiding bishopric from 1920 up until 1925, and he warned his brother in 1925, before the 1925 World General Conference, do not go through with this supreme directional control thing. I know you want to push it through. Don't. You have no idea what's going to happen when this does. And of course, Fred M. said, "Yeah, thanks for that. I'm on my own, and so are you." And so Israel A. resigned in 1925, and then he goes and sets up a law practice in Independence, but the law practice didn't thrive, and he and his family struggled financially for several years. But in 1930, Fred M. asked him to take on the role of the general church secretary. Now, stop for a second. This is really interesting. In spite of the conflict and difficulty, these two remained in a very good relationship. You don't ask someone to become the general church secretary whom you are angry with and dislike. And so that's a little lesson along the side for us. So Fred M. died in March of 1946, and the General Conference followed immediately in April, and Israel A. was to succeed him as prophet president at the age of 70. That makes a lot of us feel really, really good that he's going to take on leadership in a very stressful kind of role when he turns 70. The General Conference of 1946, by the way, was a real milestone gathering. It was held in the unfinished auditorium, and literally thousands of people came to Independence for that.
But part of the reason is that it wasn't widely known who it was that was going to be the next president of the church. And so there was anticipation that there could be some surprises or some conflict or in hockey terms, some blood on the ice. No. But people
peaceably put there.
right, of course. But people were really curious and interested in what they sensed that this was a pivotal moment, and they were right. in the life of the church. And so they had a hard time seating everybody. And there's actually a little little comment, I think it's in Mark Shearer's book, that Fred M. would have smiled because there were so many church members that said he'd planned for the auditorium to be too big. That would never be full. And it was over full. They had, I mean, fire laws now would not have allowed that many people in the building. But the church was very coalescing around this new moment in its history.
And by the way, Mark Shearer's book also will tell you how many gallons of gravy the Laurel Club had to make for trying to feed hundreds and hundreds of people in the Laurel Club for that conference. So it's quite impressive, actually. So
gravy, mashed potatoes.
We're good with that. So Israel traveled internationally a couple times. He traveled to French Polynesia in the summer of 1950. And he traveled to England in the summer of 1952. And that's kind of important. His half-brother had done some of that travel before him. But it's important to help begin expanding the church leadership sense of the church being a much more international church. So Israel facilitated expansion of the church into other countries by seeking out and preparing leaders who had some international experience or gifts. And this is post-World War II. So there were leaders in the church who had international experience due to their military service in the war. And so in 1954, there was the first conversion of a member in Korea. In 1958, the first conversion in India and Pakistan, and then expansion in Mexico in that same period. So Israel puts in place people who can expand the missionary efforts more effectively in existing countries, but also that will allow future expansion into many new countries. So what we'll deal with in our subsequent session, our next session, the rapid expansion of the church internationally, in some ways this is being prepared during Israel A's presidency. And Israel served as president until June 14th, 1958, when he was killed in a car accident on US 69 in Missouri on his way to Lamoni to a stake conference to set apart a stake president. So that was very devastating for the church. And W. Wallace succeeded him immediately at the conference of 1958. So.
Good. So some insights, I guess, is how we would say it about Israel A. And one thing, we've already mentioned it, his warnings to Fred M. about running over people in the church with his ideas. So he was very sensitive to Fred M.'s presidency that was very unsettling for some people, but very invigorating for other members who could begin to see that the church might be coming into its own in its own time. And so he's aware that there are these different groups of people. As already mentioned, Israel had stood up to his brother and said, "Don't do this. This is going to destroy a lot of people." And he was right. I mean, there were a lot of people who left, some who came back, but he had counseled Fred M. to do things differently. And I think Israel knew that a denominational body is made up of different kinds of people. And I think if you look in your own congregations, you will recognize some of these. There are those who are trying to figure out, how can the church be relevant in this time? Where do we need to make changes? How do we become more vital? But then there are those whose life circumstances means that the church needs to be a place where they can be safe, where they can be taken care of, where a place of stability and assurance. So that's a couple different kinds of people. Then there are some who want to have absolute knowledge, either on who God is, or what the church is, or what the purpose is, or what the right list of beliefs is. There are those in a congregation who are looking for strong leaders that they can trust in. And if you think about it, Fred M. and Israel A. are in different of those categories themselves. They're two of those different kinds of people. And there's, of course, other categories as well. And so, of course, they would lead differently. But to totally disregard any of those categories of members means that we're creating discord, or the idea that some people are invisible and don't deserve to be heard, or that their concerns or needs aren't as important as others. And I think Israel A. really was fine-tuned to this. But, there are seeds in what Fred M. planted in the church that were already growing in Israel A.'s time. They were growing, and they would continue to reveal themselves as places of forward movement and forward thought, and giving the church some room and abilities to change. So what does this all mean theologically? I mean, you could look at this as being pastoral or sociological, but I think some very, very theological questions are raised in this awareness of the different kinds of purposes that a church has for the different kinds of people in it. And one is a theological question is, what is the nature of the church? Is it a force to bring change in the world of what we believe God wants us to be? Or is it a place where people can find refuge amid the uncertainties of the world and of life, and be assured that God is with them, and that maybe that there's a concrete path that they can follow? And maybe some of both. And then the very question, who is God? Who is this God that we are listening to guide us and to call us forward? What is this kingdom we call Zion? And you'll find that Fred M. and Israel A. had different kinds of answers to that, both coming from our previous tradition. So lots of theological questions emerging as Israel A. Brings his own sensitivities, care, pastoral care to the church.
Next thing we want to talk about is the relationship between context and theology. This is really important. We've done this all along in our sessions, but it's very important to understand that theology, or a church's sense of itself and its social, historical, economic, gender context, really shape how it understands the good news of Jesus. And so the gospel is always understood culturally and contextually. And so trying to understand Israel A.'s context is really quite important for understanding his tenure and some of the things that happened in the church. One other way we could say this is that in terms of the Gospel of John, the Word becomes flesh, but it only becomes real in flesh and blood in real flesh and blood settings, right? And so that's what context is, and why it's so important for understanding theology. I mean, medieval theology sounds very, medieval because that's its context. But at the same time, the good news of Jesus is present in it. So this is how these things survive together. So what was Israel A's context? Well, it's quite different from Fred M's, right? So Fred M is navigating the church through rapid industrialization in the United States, World War I, the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, World War II. He's got more than one train wreck to deal with in his context. So Israel A's context is post-Great Depression. The Great Depression is now fairly a long ways behind people. Doesn't mean the economic struggles are behind everybody, but the Depression was. This is post-World War II, and there's a post-war economic boom. There is a baby boom that begins after the war, and members who had served in the military come back home with new cultural experiences and lenses. They're going to see things differently from how they saw them before. Federally in the United States, there's a thing called the GI Bill. And the GI Bill then begins to fund college education for veterans, at least generally it needs to be understood that generally it was for white veterans, as there was a certain racist element written into it. But there's that. So there's an increasing level of education in the church. The church's debt has been paid off. That debt that hovered over the church for so long has been paid off. The auditorium is nearly finished. It's going to be finished by 1958, I think, right? Yeah. And so, and the church has money. Hallelujah. The church has funds, and it has lots of needs for more full-time ministers, or as they were called then, appointees. And so that's the context in which Israel enters the presidency. It's a context in which the church really is poised to grow, and so that's going to be part of his of what happens during his.
You want to say anything about the pictures?
Oh, the pictures, yeah. This is a little montage from the 1950s. And Israel is over on the far left as you face the screen. Right a little bit above him is Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the landmark federal decision against segregation. And this was going to have a slow but steady impact in the church in terms of the church dealing with its own problems with racism.
And Mark Shearer's book is a very good one to do a read there to get a sense of some of the struggles within the church.
So right above there is an atomic bomb explosion. We've now entered the atomic age, and of course with that the Cold War. And related to the Cold War, in the center is a picture of the Korean War. And the Korean War was as costly to the United States as the Vietnam War, but remembered far less. Then on the far right top is Fidel Castro and the spread of communism into the far western world and southern hemisphere. And below that is an interesting picture. Now I can't remember her last name. Her first name is Catherine. No, it's not. It's Catherine. It's she's being sworn in as the deputy director of Civil Defense League. So in other words, women are slowly starting to enter public life in a different way. And that's Dwight Eisenhower looking on there. So at least where I found the picture, that was the captioning of it. This is a swearing-in ceremony. So that's Israel's context. That's the church's context in that period too.
Things past, but also a harbinger of things that are developing. So what are some of the theological themes in this period that are quite often revolving around Israel A? Well, he is a pastor, and as I've already said, he felt acutely the situation of church members in Fred M's time, and he knew the places in the church that were still hurting. He knew the places where there had been disillusionment and disenfranchisement, and he turns out to be a very good listener to people, and he is very reliant on the Holy Spirit and listening for the Spirit, but also listening to people. He's aware of the releases, like in the church, of anxiety after the Depression and World War II, and the funding issues that had been there. But for him, leading the church is about the people and about relationship with God and the people. And so if you haven't noticed this before, if you've never wandered through the Doctrine and Covenants to see what these different presidents may have brought to the church in the form of sections in the Doctrine and Covenants, you'll see something very indicative of Israel A. And that is how he signs some of those sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Your servant in Christ, servant of the church. That's in first one is in Doctrine and Covenants section 139. The second one is in 141, and then in Doctrine and Covenants 142, your servant, and Doctrine and Covenants 143, servant of the church. So this was very much his view of his role, was to be a servant, maybe a servant to the servants. And he took that role in his time with people, in his listening to the concerns, especially as he listened carefully internationally.
So we've mentioned already these important key terms in Israel's presidency: harmony and unity. And so they show up all over the place in his writings and in this period, brought about by encouragement and affirmation, by really pointing to God's action in his ministry and in the church's life. He really does that a lot. As Charmaine has mentioned this already, he's very attuned to God's presence and activity in the life of the church. And so he lives that out. God is a real and living and present God who interacts with him and the church. I think it's very interesting to
You'll see
pick up on
that
that.
again in some of the sections that he wrote, where he talks about being prayerful and sensing the Spirit guiding him to call certain people. Very specific about God's role in the process, as well as his own. I think that is humbling, but also makes God's action in the life of the church more real to regular members.
A more international church is beginning to emerge in this period, and it needs to. And Israel is aware of that. So he's trying to find church members and also appointees who can function in international settings. Do they have language abilities? Have they had experience in other cultures? This is going to be a growing concern of church leaders. But he does not yet see, and really I think most church leaders did not yet see, many of the structural and theological implications that internationalizing is going to require of the church. So we will learn as we go through subsequent sessions in our classes with you that once you begin internationalizing and entering into other contexts, really, it's going to have a kickback effect on you. It will change you and how you see and understand the good news of Jesus. So one of the interesting things, though, that he did see was that his brother's view of, we got to get everybody gathered to Jackson County, we've got to get these communities going. He understood, Israel understood that was not going to be possible for lots of people around the world, right? And so he's aware that the idea of Zion, he still believes in the gathering more or less, but he begins to expand what gathering can mean, and he starts to give it a new sort of spiritual twist that hadn't been there before. So this section of the Doctrine and Covenants is so important. Quote, "The work of preparation and the perfection of my saints go forward slowly, and Zionic conditions are no further away nor any closer than the spiritual condition of my people justifies. But my words shall not fail, neither will my promises, for the foundation of the Lord standeth sure." This is 1947. And this is before his trip to Tahiti, which is 3 years later. But he is aware that you can't just tell a worldwide church, hey, everybody, if you really want to know Jesus well, when he comes back, you got to come to Jackson County, Missouri, right? Because a lot of people are going to say, I can't. How can I do that, right? And so understanding Zion as a condition becomes a brand new way to think about Zion in the church. Now, Joseph III had some ideas like that, but Fred M. really kind of wanted to focus on the physical gathering because of his desire to politically and socially change the world for justice. And he knew that a gathered group of people could do that. But Fred M. has a different context, right? So the gathering is no longer tied to a place, at least for one place for Israel A. And in the midst of thinking these things through, he makes a trip to French Polynesia. And to make a long story short, there's a great section on this in Mark Scherer's book. But Polynesian church members were like, Brother Israel, there's no way. There's no way we can just up and move to independence. We can't afford it. There's just no way to do it. And he has a revelatory experience at a place in Tahiti called Taravao. And you can read the whole revelation. It's in Mark Scherer's book. And it essentially is, gathering can take place locally, and that's a good thing. But it essentially kind of widens out what Zion can be. Zion is no longer something that has to be in Missouri. And somebody like me from Michigan is like, yes, please, thank you, right? So, but people in Tahiti are like, oh, really, we can really have Zionic conditions here. And Israel is like, well, yes, of course. It will help you if you can gather people together and make a bigger impact.
Right. And maybe not always permanently, but for gatherings where you can come and strengthen each other, you can learn from each other, you can be strengthened in your faith and in your effect on the community.
Yeah.
So it's like talking about centers of Zion or centralizing of the community.
And that will emerge a little later in the United States in Detroit Stake and Los Angeles Stake. In other words, stakes way outside of
Washington.
And in Seattle, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So another thing that happens here, and is a key theme, is evangelizing. And Fred M. really believes we have to expand the church by sharing the church's story and baptizing new members. So it's important to know that still the background theology of most people and lots of church leaders is that 1912 preaching chart that we showed a couple of sessions ago. And that preaching chart in the 1950s is slowly going to be turned into a missionary series called the Go Ye and Teach series. And that will finally be fine-tuned by the 1960s, but that was begun during Israel A's time to take that basic old church theology and make it shareable in someone's home, so that by the time they had worked, a missionary had worked through with a family or an individual, the stuff on the preaching chart, they were ready to join the church, right? So that's going on here. But Israel A really had a strong conviction that the church's message needed to go out farther than it had heretofore.
And that we needed a lot more people doing the evangelizing, a lot more missionaries, and wanting to reconstitute the quorums of 70 that had been decimated during the downsizings of the previous decades.
So it's important to know when Israel A became president in 1946, the membership of our denomination was about 134,000. And at his death in 1958, just 12 years later, the membership was more than 174,000. So Paul Edwards gives us these kind of rounded figures in his book, but that's about a 30% increase in membership. Now you have to note culturally that this is also the baby boom period, so it may not all be adult converts, but still, that's a pretty significant growth for a tiny denomination, 30% in 12 years. So that was part of his hope and desire, and he expressed that regularly.
Another thing that was very important to Israel A was education and openness to knowledge, all kinds of knowledge, scientific knowledge, sociological knowledge, health knowledge. And so it started creating mechanisms, departments, ways within the church for there to be training. Started out with especially training for full-time ministers in the church. And as that group continued to grow, more and more was offered to them, but also kinds of training for regular members and ministers in congregations. Very strongly believed that there was much that we could learn and we needed to, and also it would help us to be better at missionary outreach. And he didn't put he didn't censure views that were not his own. We'll say again a little later that in some ways Israel A was conservative, actually, a term that Mark Shearer uses, in a way, conservative as in carrying on the tradition, and yet he was not against voices that would say new things. One very specific thing is Clifford Cole's book that came out around this time called The Prophets Speak. And while many church leaders were still talking about prophets as foreseeing the future and predictive kinds of things, Clifford Cole is talking about prophets, the Old Testament prophets, as speaking God's truth in their time against injustice. And so even though many church leaders had this other elevated view of prophets as being these foretellers, there wasn't any pushback on Cole's different kind of view of what prophets were and how that might be important for the church. So School of the Restoration, which for those who know about Temple School, what is a precursor to Temple School and to the Seminary and to CIMM, which you're partaking in right now. So all of these were preparing the church to be open to the expanding knowledge and possibilities, tools that would be good for the church to grow, but also for the church to grow intellectually as well as spiritually and in numbers.
So another thing that happens during Israel's tenure as president is a kind of theological deepening. Now, he's not averse to this, but this is not his thing in some ways, right? But what he does is he has guys around him who are actually very theologically sophisticated and well-read. Among them are F. Henry Edwards and Arthur Oakman, both of whom grew up in England, and both of whom, so someday I'm going to do a presentation and a paper titled The Anglican Connection, right? because both F. Henry Edwards and Arthur Oakman were shaped in the British school system growing up, and so Anglicanism is deeply woven into that. And these two figures are very, very important for keeping classical Christian theological ideas grounded inside the Restoration language, the language of the incarnation, of the Trinity, and so on. And they're widely respected by church members. So classical Christian theological language helps deepen the reorganization, and these two fellows are very responsible for that. At the same time, Roy Cheville is in his cheerleader heyday at this period, and
Who he is?
Roy Cheville taught religion at Graceland University. I think he was perhaps the mothership of extroverts. He led cheers at football games. He loved to lead church members in singing. And apparently, I've heard that if you didn't sing right, he would stop you and make you sing loud and right and fast. And so, but Roy Cheville was one of the most formally theologically educated persons in the church at the time. He had graduate degrees in religion and theology from the University of Chicago, a PhD eventually, and taught a couple of generations of people who became church leaders. He taught them at Graceland. And so Roy Cheville was very much shaped by current trends in American Protestant theology. And so between him and Arthur Oakman and F. Henry Edwards and others, but these three for sure, there's this exposure to the wider Christian tradition, the language of the wider Christian tradition, especially as it was understood in mid-20th century. And that really impacts the church going into the 60s and 70s and right up to today.
Good. And previously, we have talked about the church having to determine its identity by pushing off from we call the Mormon boundary on one side and the Protestant boundary on the other side, and finding our identity somewhere in between. During Israel's time, there was an unfortunate situation where by trying to be courteous at a Mormon gathering, some things that Israel did were taken wrong, and there became some tension, that'll be the mild thing to say, as church members started questioning what he had done, and some Mormon missionaries were making hay out of that and telling church members that we were combining our churches, things like that. And so that Mormon boundary got reinforced during this time with that I would say unfortunate misunderstanding. And then, but as Tony's already noted, the Protestant boundary is becoming more porous, and it's helping us as a church identify with some of our earliest impulses, Trinitarian impulses, to reinforce those again within our movement. So one side is getting a little bit thicker and one side is getting a little bit thinner.
So we'll conclude just by saying that in this period, the church is poised for a revolution. All right. The revolution's not going to take place in the 1950s. But when we get into the 1960s and 70s, things are going to radically alter in the reorganization. And it's really helpful not to see that as somehow just magically dropping on the church once W. Wallace is president. No, during Israel's time as president, things are already moving in that direction, and he's making space for those things to happen. Kind of a couple of summary statements. I'll read you one from Paul Edwards about Israel's context and period, and Charmaine will read one from Mark Scheer. Then we'll conclude with a few things and go on to some questions. So Paul Edwards says this: the history of the church during this time, Israel's time, was a history of internal inquiry and adjustment that resulted from external efforts. New theological understandings, expanding evangelical efforts — I think he meant evangelistic, but he said evangelical — and concentrated domestic growth, all centered around what it meant to be the church in a world still suffering from several decades of depression and war, end of quote. That's how he sees Israel's context.
And then from Shearer, Israel presided over a time of transition as the church journeyed forward. With the new leadership that emerged after 1958, the church took significant steps away from being a remnant church and toward being a church in mission. But steps were being taken during Israel's years as well. Compared to many leaders who followed him, Israel was theologically conservative, understood the need to embrace institutional change, but also the need to implement that change slowly, and I would add pastorally. The lessons of his brother's presidential administration taught him that.
So this is a kind of an important transitional period in the development of Community of Christ theology, and it's quite important, I think, to be aware of it. And finally, just to say something about theology itself, Christian theology it's always in orbit around two poles of like an ellipse. On one end is, I'll call it faithfulness, being true to the source, right? Being true to the good news of Jesus. On the other end is credibility. And that's being true to the setting we live in, being relevant to the setting. Both things belong there. A focus only on relevance tends to lose Christian identity. A focus only on faithfulness tends to turn into wooden kinds of fundamentalism and an inability to change or learn new things. Both things belong together, and you can see both things functioning in the time of Israel A. Smith, and you'll see them in the periods that follow. So, David, we are ready for some questions.
Wonderful. Good. Well, we don't take that much time with Israel. And it is, I think you're right, because of the personalities that come before him and after him. And the short period of time. I mean, people still remember that Joseph Smith III, his administration during this time, which was forever. And generationally, it was. And then you have Fred that comes in and disturbs a lot of the norms. As generational groups usually do, don't they? You know, your kids come in and totally throw out everything and then realize there are some things they need to hold on to. I always think it's interesting among brothers, and we have three brothers who come along in the presidency in a fairly rapid pace. So let's talk a little bit about the setting that we have Israel in, and you mentioned it a little bit. We've just gone through a depression, and we've gone through 2 world wars. And even though Korea is going on at this point, we do have kind of this different breath that's being taken in here in America, and in Europe, and in many other places of the world. But it's a different time period, isn't it? And how does that really have an impact on this administration?
I think one thing is that at least in the United States, I suspect this is true in Canada, but at least in the United States, American social life is highly progress oriented in this period. Science and technology, everything is growing at a rapid pace. By the time you get to the end of the 50s, there are television sets in people's homes, and different kinds of communication are taking place. By the way, the church was already ahead of the game in terms of radio communication, but but some things had to change in the
And
50s.
what was the radio? KLDS.
The church had its own radio station for a while until at some point the Federal Communications Commission said, I don't think you can do it this way. So there were some rules.
It couldn't be a church related station, but you could buy time on other stations that weren't. And that eventually is what the church did. But yeah, it was kind of groundbreaking as far as making sermons available over the radio. The station or one of the stations was just across the street here.
Yeah,
At
on top
Stone
of
Church.
on top of Stone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So so the ways of communicating pretty open to those possibilities for the church.
So the church in the United States, at least, is feeling the sense of rapid movement. There's an expansion of the birth rate. New churches are being built. Old churches are being redone, and there's money, right? So the appointee force becomes quite large, and all of a sudden there are full-time church workers all over. So that all these things are making a difference locally at the time.
And they're moving out of independence. And I think that's probably one of the significant things. The seeds are being sown here that are going to be reaped in the next administration. As far as we briefly touched on it, on race relations, which are just about to hit the boiling point in America, as well as women's issues of coming out of a war that they participated in career-wise, and are now going back to the suburbs, so to speak. And if they are not allowed to get their own job, they're telling their daughters about it. So how is this affecting the church at this point?
Well, you can see that there are Charmaine mentioned that the church is doing all kinds of institutes and classes, and among the institutes and classes that are being held are classes on womaning, I guess you call it.
Women becoming educated.
Well said, Tony.
But I mean, it's like how to be all these roles. How to be a mother. How to what things you should do in the church. How you should live. All this kind of 1950s.
Not intended so much to be putting more things on women, but saying there may be more options out there than you think, and women taking more of a role in the church, even though ordination isn't even being, well, it's been considered for a long time for some people, but it hasn't. Church leaders are not talking about it as anything that will happen soon, but there are women in roles. There's a women's department that has a person who's very active, and eventually that will become a paid position.
Her name was Pauline Arnson.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, thanks. And so there is this recognition that, and again, during Depression and all of those really tough years, many publications that were there to support women, the column in the Herald that disappeared. All of these things are starting to come back.
What column?
There was a women's column.
Yeah,
women's home column
that came out and then disappeared.
Then during this time of all this drawing back in because of the financial problems and anyhow. So this is coming back again, but again, the voice of women is sounding a little different in this time. I think another thing is that people can't take for granted that their culture equals the kingdom of God, that their government or their country. They've seen those who've been involved in the war or have had people in the war, have seen that governments are not trustworthy necessarily, that we can't just assume that the government will take care, different countries' governments will do what's best for the people, and that maybe the church has to do some of those kinds of things separate from the culture in which it exists. And, things like the emerging civil rights movement and the women's movements are coming out of this awareness that you can't just wait for the government to tell you what you need and what's good for you, and then just wait for it to come along. But
Yeah.
that, you know, those involved in the war and not, who could see evil coming from people who had power, ruining millions, ending millions of lives. That does something to you spiritually. You have to ask the hard questions: where is God, and how can we recognize God at work in this? And how do we take what we know about God to make a different kind of story moving forward?
And at the same time, when nationalism has just blossomed as a result of the post-war era, and so there's pushback. We've got a number of questions, and I hope to get to a few of them. The first one was, could you explain this from Mark and Heather? Can you explain the movement in the Fred M's church that Israel counseled him not to do? So I think they're talking about the Supreme.
Yeah, that was Fred M. When Fred M. became prophet president, the 1919 conference, he said, "You made me your leader. Let me lead." But processes in the church at the time essentially had created like 14 churches, right? A presidency's church, kind of symbolic function, presiding bishoprics church, and then 12 different apostles' own churches. And so he did not feel like he had the capacity under those circumstances actually to lead as president. And so he wanted to change administrative processes in the church so that the presidency became kind of the CEO and the visionary, the director, and that was highly resisted by a number of leaders and church members. So,
and he wanted to move the 12 out of these roles of administrating their own little areas of the church to now being more missionary minded. He wanted to send them out to different places in the world to be missionaries and to break them loose from these places where they may have stayed for 15, 20, 25 years, and where the theology of the area where they had been serving now represented their theology, and there wasn't room then to grow. And so he's trying to consolidate the vision in himself. And he's getting some pushback, and he's not being super sensitive about this. And so it's just called Supreme Directional Control. And Israel had a problem with the name because the name,
a lot of people had trouble with the name.
And make you defensive even without
that was not marketed well. No. And I would see that Fred M went through the dirty part of that, and Israel kind of came in to solidify this unified approach in it. And someone says, my recollection is then a child was when they were a child, that Israel's accident was returning from Lamoni at a very bad portion of Highway 69 through 35 near Pattonsburg, Missouri, and that perhaps it was a weather issue, maybe fog.
Yes, so
the road was wet.
Road was wet. He had apparently pulled over. He saw a heavy downpour coming. He pulled over. Yes, it was near Pattonsburg. As far as I can recall from how Mark described it, he was on his way to Lamoni, not coming back from. And he pulled off the road. The police discovered his tire tracks. He pulled off the road to park, and apparently, as he pulled back on, a vehicle, an oncoming vehicle,
they had a collision.
They had a head-on collision, and he was mortally injured. I think he survived a little while, but And by the way, on that same stretch of road further south, not quite 10 years earlier, a very beloved apostle, George Lewis, died on that road. So an accident.
69 was a terrible way. But it did also shock the church and create another vacuum for which I'm sure we'll be exploring in the next time. But it again places us in a situation of trying to come up with, well, what happens when the president of the church passes away, especially unexpectedly. And this was a shocking experience for the church.
Yeah.
I'm glad, Chairman.
That was something that all of these, FM, Fred M, and then Israel A, they were very aware of how problematic not having a successor had been for Joseph Smith Jr. And so they all were very intentional about having something in place. So Fred M had designated Israel A, though not everybody knew that. That's why for that conference, it was a question. There's Albert A, who was the presiding evangelist at the time, who could have also been in that role. But that was very quickly dispelled as the conference began and discussions were made and about leadership, passing on the leadership. And Albert A said he was totally in favor of Israel being the next president. So that really diffused that possible drama.
Nobody ever says, me, are you out of your mind?
And Israel A was very intentional as well to have a plan in place and to work with W. Wallace in preparation and to prepare other people for that possibility.
Now, from the theological standpoint of the church at this time, we recognize the progression the church makes through each of these. But if you ever go back and look at the Go Ye and Teach series, you realize how far it still has to go to where we are. And especially the concept of getting people to believe that this is the only way to salvation and this church is the only one on the face of the earth.
Yeah. So there's an element of regression. I mean, compared to Fred M, there's an element of regression in some of the church's theology in Israel A's period. I mean, he kind of goes back to a lot of Book of Mormon stuff and inspired version stuff. And there were people in the church who already were like, we probably need to be more careful about how we talk about and use those texts, like Roy Cheville and others. But in some ways, I think there was a bit of while some things are moving ahead, I think there was a bit of a setback there in terms of scripture and revelation and how we understand some of these traditional texts coming out of the Restoration movement.
Though there was some movement too at this time to start closing some doors on some aspects of our history. So,
yes,
like baptism for the dead, that is appendicized at this point in our history.
Now, it wasn't appendicized in
until 1970, but
to the appendix.
Right.
It
wasn't. We were starting.
Wasn't surgically removed.
We did a slow amputation.
Yeah.
As much as
Exactly.
I think Israel was in favor of slow amputation. He already he articulates that baptism for the dead is not nonsensical to him, so he does say that. So
the things that we're going to talk about later is that one of the things that really pushes the church into recognizing God at work in other churches in other parts of the world, Israel A has really empowered to go forward, which is evangelizing, is when we reach out and share the good news with people, we're changed in the process. And that's what happens as the church has opportunities to grow in different parts of the world, is we realize we don't know how to talk about Jesus.
Yeah, well,
but
we're creating ways of teaching how to do that. With the School of the Restoration becomes one of the first formal teaching process for the priesthood since basically Kirtland. And so
that structure is in place.
It's coming.
Essential for this new developments that will not push us, but invite us into recognizing God at work within the church
Push some of
and
us.
in the world.
Yes.
Yes, it's pretty
You
uncomfortable.
know, one minute you're starting the school of the restoration, the next minute Tony's grading your paper.
Oh, wonderful. Folks, thanks so much for sharing with us today. We're at our time limit, so we're going to go ahead and end. Next week, we will take on part 6 of this series, and so we hope you'll join us then.